Okay.
Welcome everybody to this Relevant Researchers Network meeting. This is our first meeting back since our conference in October, so it's lovely to be back into our monthly meetings. Today we have Nick Allott as our speaker. Nick is based in the Department of Literature, Area Studies and European Languages at the University of Oslo. He's currently a research associate on the research project Creativity and Convention in Pragmatic Development, Typical and Atypical Perspectives, and is co-founder of the research group Pragmatics, Theory and Experiments, also at the University of Oslo. He works on a range of topics within pragmatics, including the philosophy of linguistics, legal language and interpretation, inference, reasoning and rationality, and word meaning and the literal figurative distinction. And he's going to talk to us today with the title, Our Theory of Communication Needs a Literal Metaphorical Distinction. Over to you, Nick.
Wow, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. And my co-author on this, and thank you everybody for coming as well. My co-author on this, the paper that this talk is based on is Mark Texter, and he's here, but I think I'm going to do most of the talking, unless he can always jump in if I say something wrong. But otherwise, I think he'll be here mainly to chip in on the question and answer session at the end. So here's the plan for today. So first, I want to talk about why some people have abandoned the literal figurative distinction, at least in theories of communication. And this is the Relevance Researchers Network. So in particular, the focus there is on Sperber and Wilson and Carsten, and the view that metaphor is continuous with literal use and loose use and hyperbole. Then I'll talk a bit about why we actually need the literal figurative distinction, why we can't give it up, even in our theory of communication. And depending on how much time there is by the time we get there, the third section is about some previous attempts to rescue the distinction and quick explanations of why we think that they don't work. But the thing I really want to get to is our proposal. So we have a proposal for the literal figurative distinction, a way of saving it or resurrecting it, depending on what you think its current status is. So that's where we're heading. So part one is about reasons why people have thought that the literal figurative distinction is in trouble and maybe is completely untenable, at least in theories of communication, theories of utterance interpretation. Here are two sentences, two clauses from Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is the son, and Juliet is alive. And one of these, of course, is one of the most famous examples, which seems to crop up in practically every paper on metaphor. Juliet is the son. The other one is intended literally. It's very obvious in the context, but you can see it's intuitively clear that one of these is metaphorical and the other one is probably literal. And it is, if you look at the context in the play. So we have these very clear intuitions about literal and figurative speech. And there's nothing special about those examples. So the examples with cut, example 1 to A to D on the left, it's pretty clear that the first three are literal uses. And the third one, well, it's a kind of fossilized metaphorical use, isn't it? But it's obvious that there's something different about it. And the difference is to do with the fact that presumably the first time it was used, it was a really novel metaphor. In 2A and 2B, 2B is a classic example actually from the experimental literature on metaphor. It's very clear that 2B is metaphorical, 2A is probably literal, and similarly there's a contrast between 3A and 3B. So it's a very intuitive distinction. So why would anyone think that it's in trouble? Well, the traditional deviation view of figurative use can be expressed in different ways. A linguist's way of saying it might be the way I've got in the subheading here. So figurative uses are ones that express a different sense from the linguistically encoded sense. there's a lovely dictionary of literary terms that some of you will probably know, Abrams and Harpham. And they say figurative language is a conspicuous departure from what competent users of a language apprehend as the standard meaning of words in order to achieve some special meaning or effect. There are many different, slightly different statements of this deviation view. It seems to be the folk linguistic view of figurative use. But, and I probably don't need to go into a great deal of detail about this, but I give you a few examples. Deviation is arguably ubiquitous. Lexical modulation is all over the place once you start looking, as I'm sure most of you are very well aware. And also there's polysemy, and I'm not going to try and distinguish between those two phenomena. For our purposes, we don't need to do that. But so here are some examples, famous examples from Searle. We already saw: cut bread, cut hair, cut the grass. Now the point of these examples is that in each of these cases, it seems like there's a slightly different sense of cut being expressed. And yet they're all literal uses. Some examples from Chomsky. John read the book on his computer, book content, something like that. John burned the book, a different sense, book object. Some examples which will be known to people here. So that bottle is empty. It's okay to say that even when there are a few drops of wine left at the bottom. The garden is south facing, probably not exactly. I'm not drinking tonight. Maybe that's been, that might be narrowed, so it's expressing a different sense from the encoded sense. So it's all over the place. And Deirdre and Robin said back in 2007, lexical narrowing and broadening, which is, as most of you will know, the way they think of lexical modulation, are the outcomes of a single interpretive process which fine-tunes the interpretation of almost every word. So it's ubiquitous. And some other people go a bit further. So François Recanitis says that it happens with every word somewhere. So the problem then is that if lexical modulation is ubiquitous, even in cases that are intuitively literal, then figurative use can't be defined as use that deviates from the standard word meaning, right? That's the issue. And it's been pointed out by a number of people, including the people I list here. So what should we do? Well, one thing you could do is you could try and reject ubiquitous lexical modulation. You could say, oh, that's not right. These really aren't different senses that are being expressed. I'm not going to go into that today. Another thing you can do is to accept ubiquitous lexical modulation and reject the literal figurative distinction, at least in theories of communication. And that's the standard relevance theoretic view and held by other people too. What we're going to argue for is a different way of going, third way, that we should accept, or we can accept ubiquitous lexical modulation, but we can also keep the literal figurative distinction. But we're going to need a different literal figurative distinction from the idea that it's just when you express a sense which is different from the encoded sense. In fact, we're still going to propose a deviation view, but it's not going to be that. So, well, anyway, option two, I already said this really, it's currently influential, at least for metaphor. So this is option two: keep radical lexical pragmatics, reject the literal metaphorical distinction, at least in theories of communication. So at least in processing, there's no qualitative categorical distinction between literal and figurative use. That's this view. And figurative and metaphor, these kinds of terms, they're just folk terms. So it's not that we don't use them, it's not that we don't apply them to things that people say, but we're just applying them to the output of lexical modulation. They're not terms that play a role in the theory of how communication is achieved. So here's the psychologist Rumelhart saying something along these lines back in 1979. The distinction between literal and metaphorical language is rarely, if ever, reflected in the qualitative change in the psychological processes involved in the processing of that language. And here's Dan and Deirdre saying similar thing. Metaphorical interpretations arrived at in exactly the same way as literal, loose, and hyperbolic interpretations. There's no mechanism specific to metaphors and no interesting generalization that applies only to them. And for the rest of this paper, until right near the end, I'm going to focus on the literal metaphorical distinction, I'll end up proposing a general literal figurative distinction, at least for uses of words, for literal and figurative uses of words. And I'll show that that generalizes nicely, easily to metonymy. But until we get towards the end, we're going to focus on literal versus metaphorical. And that's partly because one of our targets is this view that Dan and Deirdre have proposed. Of course, that view gets support from experimental pragmatics. So I think it's fair summary to say that lots of people think that the current state of the art is there's nothing special about metaphor. So Ira Novak says, with enough background information, a novel metaphoric phrase can be read as routinely as a non-metaphoric one. This was controversial for a long time, but seems to be pretty settled now. So that building is a prison versus John's job is a prison, and then you can look at brainwaves or ERPs. You see they have very similar trajectories. In particular, they both have an N400, at least if they're in the right kind of context or in no particular context. This is from a paper by Bambini and some other people. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. The moral of the story is, is metaphor unique as assumed by Aristotle and more recently by Grice and Searle, asks Rachel Dura, and the import of her paper is no. So that's it for part one, why the distinction is in trouble, why some people have voluntarily given it up, at least in theories of communication. Part two, now we want to argue that we need a literal figurative distinction, and we need it in theories of communication, in our view. So, well, why is giving up the literal metaphorical distinction a problem? A first thought might be, well, we lean on this distinction a lot in ordinary life. It matters in many areas of life. Taking just one, in the law. So drafters of laws, statutes, and of contracts aim to avoid non-literal expressions with the aim of avoiding unclarity. One of these papers is by a law lord talking to other lawyers and complaining that if you get non-literal expressions, it makes a mess of the law. But in fact, Dan and Deirdre and Robin and other people who have a view similar to them, they have a reply to that first thought. Perfectly good reply, which is that they can acknowledge folk theoretic norms. So Dan and Deirdre acknowledge folk theoretic norms that they take to be the source of the notions of literal meaning and what is said. So these things, literal meaning and what is said, they're not playing a role within the theory of how people understand utterances, but there's nothing to stop us in some area, some practical area of life, thinking about, what did somebody literally mean when they said that or this, or what did they say? And in fact, if you look at the legal literature around lying, perjury, there's this offense of perjury, which is lying under oath. There's a whole case law about that. And it doesn't have a whole lot to do with pragmatic theory. There are a lot of distinctions that lawyers make, and they're not to do with broadening and narrowing; they're to do with other things. And so, arguably, what they're doing is they're employing a folk theoretic notion, and they're sharpening up as necessary for a particular practical purpose. So, anyway, Dan and Deirdre don't deny the importance of the literal metaphorical distinction in relation to these kinds of things, norms of communication. But what they deny is that it plays an explanatory role in the theory of communication. It seems like a reasonable reply. So, okay. Our second thought, and we think that this is decisive, is that literal uses transmit information in a way that metaphorical ones don't. And that's a fact about communication. It's not a fact about folk norms and people commenting on how people use language, as it were, after the fact. So we need the literal metaphorical distinction in our theory of communication. Let me show you what I mean. So consider and this is an old example from a paper by Searle, Richard is a gorilla. And Searle pointed out correctly that this is not about gorillas, at least if it's meant metaphorically. Of course, Richard might be a literal gorilla, but suppose somebody utters this as a metaphor. Then it's not about gorillas. It's about a person, and it's saying something about that person. And there are various different interpretations possible, but quite likely to be something about this person being maybe a bit aggressive. Well, how gorillas actually are, shy and friendly actually, just doesn't matter for the truth or falsity or even the aptness of the metaphorical assertion. If this was a statement about gorillas, then how they actually are would matter, but how they actually are doesn't matter. So that's evidence that this is not about gorillas. And this generalizes. Here's Jerry Fodor doing something that he did a lot, wonderfully, which is saying something which seems to trivialize an issue, but actually opens up a very interesting line of thought and encapsulates it beautifully. So he says somewhere that Juliet is the sun is perhaps figuratively true, but since it's only figuratively true, it's of no astronomical interest. Very flip line. But yeah, there's something to this. There's something right about this, actually. And it's connected with the point about Richard is a gorilla. So most of you will know people who work on metaphors talk about topic and vehicle. And in Richard is a gorilla, the vehicle is gorilla. In Juliet is the sun is the vehicle. Anyway, metaphors are not about their vehicle. And since they're not about their vehicle, they don't transmit information about it. So when I say Richard is a gorilla, I am not informing you about gorillas. When I say Juliet is the sun, I am not telling you stuff about the sun. And this is why Jerry Fodor was right, that Juliet is the sun is of no astronomical interest, because it's not about the sun. So the brightest object visible from Earth is the sun. That is about the sun. And I mean, it's maybe not a very interesting statement, but it is potentially of astronomical interest. Juliet is the sun is not, and is not. Another way of saying sort of the same thing. So only a literal use of sun, or the sun, can be a link in what you might call a chain of transmission of knowledge about the subject matter. The subject matter here obviously being, the body at the center of our solar system. A metaphorical use like Juliet is the sun can't, just doesn't, metaphors just don't do that. But literal uses do, or they can. That's an important distinction. In fact, it's a really crucial distinction. And it seems to be a distinction that's to do with communication, how communication functions. It's not the kind of distinction where we scratch our heads afterwards and come up with a sort of perjury law. It's not like that, we think. Consider this claim. So somebody says the mind is a computer. You actually hear people saying this all the time. And you could mean it literally, or you could mean it metaphorically. There has actually been debate. When people say the mind is a computer, is that a metaphor? Is it a bad metaphor, a good metaphor? Well, do we mean it literally? If somebody means it metaphorically, some cognitive scientist, then the cognitive scientist, she doesn't have a theory of the mind yet. Saying that the mind is a computer metaphorically is not to offer a theory of the mind, not even a sketch of one. At best, what it is some kind of, she's kind of started saying what the mind is. She's drawing our attention, something like this. She's drawing our attention to something that is in certain respects analogous to the mind. If she means it literally, things are really different. And I'll come back to this example and I'll say exactly what we think is going on, or a bit more exactly what we think is going on if somebody means it literally. But if she means it literally, then this claim is meant to be sort of theoretical claim you can build on. It should be in principle testable. Properties of literal computers should also be properties of the mind, because you're saying the mind actually is a computer, and so on. So it could be actually the core of a theory, and it is for people who hold the computational theory of mind, people like Jerry Fodor, Georges Ray, and so on. They do mean it literally. So it matters whether something is meant literally or metaphorically, and sometimes people can argue about it. Yeah. Chairs, how am I doing for time? I want to know how fast to take this section.
It's 5 to 6.
Mhm.
So you have max 20 minutes. No, sorry, max 20 minutes. Sorry.
Okay, well, we'll take this section allegro, but not presto in that case. So one possible rescue attempt is François Becanity. He says, look, there is a figurative literal distinction, quite like the folk one. It's in terms of what he calls felt discrepancy. So we feel there's a discrepancy in the case of non-literal use. And he has this example of the ATM cash machine swallowed my credit card, chewed it up and spat it out. And he says, look, there you feel discrepancy. And so that's non-literal. Sort of phenomenological distinction, if you like. And he says about it, in the scene, the ATM is, in some sense, both a machine and a human being, hence the feeling of discrepancy. But we think this is not going to work. It's not going to capture, at least it's not going to capture the distinction we need between literal and figurative. There are literal utterances with felt discrepancy. So things like the square that the philosopher Meinong thought of as round. Squares can't be round. There's nothing figurative there. It's meant entirely literally, but you get similar kind of, ooh, that feels weird. But it also, Rick Kennedy's distinction also fails on the other side. He actually kind of, he sort of mentions this in a footnote. So he says, look, the ATM swallowed my credit card. He says, oh, well, there probably isn't any felt discrepancy. At least, normally we would just swallow that utterance the way the ATM swallowed the credit card without even probably noticing that it was metaphorical. And there's evidence from experimental literature on metaphors that people often don't even notice that metaphors are going by. So not all intuitively metaphorical use has felt discrepancy. So we don't think that'll work. That was obviously far too breezy, but I have to be fairly breezy because we want to get to our distinction, or our way of making the distinction, I should say. Another thing you could do is you could say on non-literal uses where there's a semantic feature which is somehow central and it's dropped. If you think that words have meaning features or semantic features, a number of people, including those people, have proposed this. So if you accept that words have semantic features, and you also accept that some such lexical semantic features are special, then the criterion would be if one of these is not used in constructing the word type meaning, it's dropped or it's suppressed or something, then the result is non-literal. So maybe the feature affects material object in cut taxes, or the feature of building in John's job is a prison, or something like that. That looks quite promising, but there are a couple of problems. One is a very old problem, pointed out by L.J. Cohen back in 1979. So central features are dropped in literal uses too. So that man is a rabbit, a metaphorical case. I saw a rabbit running, literal. I'm cooking rabbit, also literal. Suppose we think that rabbit has at least these features: animate, farm animal, edible, meat, and they're all pretty central. Well, the problem is that, one drops farm animal and meat, but each of those features is also dropped or suppressed or whatever in one of the literal uses. Meat in 2 and farm animal in 3. Again, one could and should, say a lot more about this. You could have counter arguments to the counter argument and so on, but no time for that now. Maybe in the Q&A if you want. In any case, there's another problem which has been noticed more recently with these kinds of theories, and it's that, look, roughly speaking, the best evidenced features, the features for which there's best evidence in lexical semantics, are various features of verbs, aspect features and thematic role features, for those for whom that means something. Proper linguists, you know who you are. And it seems that those ones are preserved in metaphorical use. So just several people seem to have noticed this independently. So here's a nice example from Michael Landsberg's paper on this. So he says, English and Italian both have words that mean roughly blush, But the English one, blush, it's an atelic verb, means something like do, having red cheeks. Whereas arrosire is a telic verb, it means something like to become, having red cheeks. And so you get this contrast between John blushed all day long, which is good, and the Italian direct translation, which is bad, because this kind of durative adverbial is bad with telic verbs, because they're about coming into a state rather than about being in one. And metaphorical uses of blush and the Italian counterpart are possible. Sky blushed, same in Italian. And crucially, this is now we're finally getting to the argument, they obey the same constraint. So the sky blushed all day long is good in English, and the sky blushed all day long is bad in Italian. So that aspectual feature is apparently preserved when you go between literal and figurative uses. And you might think, well, okay, this is something specific about blush and arrosire, or something specific about English and Italian. It doesn't seem to be. It's been noticed across a number of different languages. The Spolek and McNally Spolek papers we're referring to do a systematic comparison of English and Spanish, and they say, look, thematic features and telisty features are preserved across scare quotes literal and scare quotes figurative uses. And the scare quotes, because they say, well, look, the features are preserved across them. So, you know, we know them when we see them, but they have no theoretical basis for them, as for current relevance theory. One more attempt to save the distinction. This is something Robin and Catherine Wearing have suggested, so that metaphor might be broadening plus narrowing. So lexical pragmatics in modern relevance theory is done in terms of broadening and narrowing. So you have cases like John's job is a prison. And metaphor definitely has to involve broadening, at least in typical cases in relevance theory. So prison, these are some strict and literal prisons, Alcatraz and Reading Jail. And here's prison star, which is the broadened ad hoc concept, which is expressed when somebody says John's job is a prison, and John's job has to fall in the denotation of prison star, extension of prison star. But crucially, I don't know if you can see the arrow, but crucially note that there's a little segment of the denotation of prison, the strict and literal concept, which has been left behind. And in there is this prison, which is a prison in Norway. This really is a prison, believe it or not. It's an open prison. This is a picture from a story on CNN called "The Nicest Prison in the World." Anyway, so it's probably not very confining. That's the point. So if prison star means something like things which confine people in a certain way, then John's job and those two other prisons, Alcatraz, you know, those are confining, but this prison in Norway probably isn't very confining. So in that case, there's been broadening, but also narrowing. And Robin and Catherine suggest that this might be criterial for metaphor, distinguish it from other cases where there's broadening involved. There's a problem with that, which Mark and I pointed out in slightly different contexts some time ago, which is that lexical and ad hoc concepts can be co-extensional. So here's an example. So Kaisa is the god of chess. There she is. This is an attested example that Mark found in Chessbase India. Many Indian chess fans, Anand is the god of chess. So one, god of chess is meant literally in one, and it's meant metaphorically in two, right? And yet, it's very possible that god of chess is actually empty in one, because there is actually, strictly speaking, no god of chess. Kaisa doesn't actually exist. And who knows, perhaps we find out that Anand and everybody else in the chess world has been cheating by means of chess computers and implants. Actually, I wrote this in the paper this talk is based on, and then there were all kinds of stories about similar things happening. I didn't mean to be foreseeing this, but it seems like we foresaw something in the world of chess. Anyway, but then maybe nobody's good enough at chess actually to be the god of chess, and then maybe the this metaphorical phrase, God of chess, is also empty. So we have a literal and a metaphorical version of God of chess. And intuitively, they're different. So one of them at least would have to be an ad hoc concept. And yet here it's clearly possible that they're coextensional, because it's clearly possible that they're both empty. They have nothing in their denotation. Anyway, again, one could say much more about this, but we think this is actually deadly for relying on broadening and narrowing as criterial for anything along these lines. So in the last 10 minutes or so, here's our proposal. So I want to set it out, and then I'll take you through a few advantages that it has. So we call it the non-conformity view of non-literal use. And it draws on work by various people. And there's a kind of tradition that it's drawing on that a lot of you will know in the philosophy of language as well, sort of behind this work. So our claim about literal uses is that they're uses of a sense of a word made with the intention to continue a tradition of using a word. And the central case is the speaker intends to conform and to use the word as other people, in particular its originators, use or used it. And that's what makes something a literal use. And a metaphorical use is one which doesn't so conform, but does depend on the pre-existing practice that runs through the literal uses. This is a bit abstract. I will go through some examples and hopefully it'll become clear. But I wanted to point out, this is an asymmetric dependency view. So the literal uses and the metaphorical uses both depend on the literal tradition of word use. But the literal uses do not depend on the metaphorical uses. So there's an asymmetric dependency there. And in fact, I haven't given a reference here, but Georges Rey had already pointed that out about metaphorical uses. Here's a piece of evidence. So see if you can do it. If you can, we want to know. Can you coin a new word and simultaneously use it metaphorically? And it has to be monomorphemic. It's no good thinking of a word like hardball or something, because there you're levering the traditions of hard and ball and combine. Anyway, that's no good. And we think it's impossible. You can't start a fashion and subvert it at the same time. So the metaphorical uses depend on the existence of the literal practice of using a word. That's what this is evidence for. Give you an example. So back to the sun. The sun is a main sequence star. It's about the sun. It's within the tradition of the use of the sun. Here, using the phrase the sun to refer to, well, the sun. Metaphorical uses rely on the lexical tradition, but they fall outside of it. Juliet is the sun, as we said before. It's not about the sun. It's not a contribution to astronomy. Shakespeare, when he wrote Juliet is the sun, he didn't want to conform to the original use of the sun. He would be very mistaken if he had intended to conform to that original use of the sun, or he would have made Romeo be very mistaken, because he would have been saying that Juliet is that ball of gases at the middle of our solar system. But Shakespeare, he didn't use that expression at random. He used the expression because he wanted to draw on or to riff on the literal tradition. He wanted to draw on information associated with the sun, things like striking and central. So here's the asymmetric dependency again. Some definitions now. So we need to define a thing which we call a conservative chain. So a word is originated at some point in the past, and then it's passed on from speaker to speaker, where each of the speakers has the intention to conform to the people from which he or she acquired the word. And then a literal use of a word is a use of it that's part of a conservative chain. Whereas a non-literal use, including metaphorical uses, but non-literal uses in general, they're uses of the word which are neither an originating use, nor made with the intention to conform to an originating use or the ongoing tradition. But the use is sensitive to some information associated with the originating use as passed through the tradition. So that's the view. I hope it's reasonably clear. You can ask more about it in the Q&A. I just want to finish by taking us through some of the advantages. So one is we have a literal figurative, this is the main advantage, right? Because we claim to have solved the problem. We have a literal figurative distinction that's not vitiated by the fact that literal meanings are multiple, contextually sensitive, and so on. And I'll say more about that in a moment. The second thing is, it's an advantage for us that we don't need to commit ourselves to any particular theory of lexical semantics. So you might think, as we have argued in the past, that words don't even, they don't typically denote concepts. Certainly some people think this. So maybe words don't, strictly speaking, have semantics at all in the sort of philosophical referential sense. And we don't need to be committed on that. It makes sense of cases where we're not sure, and I'll say how, but ones like the mind is a computer. It works for cases that were problematic for Griceans, like negated and twice apt metaphors, which is some advantage. It applies very neatly to verbal metaphors. It would be a pain if it only applied to, Juliet is the sun and one's in that form, but actually it applies to verbal metaphors just as nicely. And it covers metonymy with no further stipulation as well. Taking those slightly out of order, just because it's easier to explain this way. So the mind is a computer, again. Is this really in the same tradition as obviously literal talk about computers? This is what we think people are really thinking about when they're thinking about whether it's literal or metaphorical. So remember we talked about conservative modulation. Conservative chains. We also think that you can have conservative modulation. It's not really modulation. It's when you find out that the use that you hadn't really considered before does actually fit within the tradition. So suppose you've only ever used the word computer to apply to artifacts, maybe only to things made out of, metal or semi-metals like silicon. Well, then if one use literally is true, then some properties that you've previously taken to be essential to computers, you learn they're not, in fact, actually essential. So if Jerry Fodor convinces you that the mind is literally a computer, then maybe you learn something about computers and about the meaning of the word computer as well. So the concept and the word does really apply to minds. So you could see this as a modulation, but it's within the tradition. You're just learning something about the tradition you're already participating in. Similarly, if you use it, conversely, if you use it metaphorically, it invites the hearer to imagine some properties of computers as applied to minds. And that's a completely different kind of thing to be doing. There's a sharp distinction here in principle. We can be confused about which is going on because we don't know which of these two things is how we're supposed to take it, at least on some occasions. When Jerry Fodor says the mind is a computer, actually, it's very clear that he means the first of these two things. So that's an advantage. How did we solve the main problem? Well, look, cut bread, cut hair, cut the grass, they're all within the tradition. I mean, you might never have considered before you saw a lawnmower that you can cut something in that way, the kind of way that a lawnmower cuts, sort of horizontally and so on. Maybe you already knew about cutting things like bread and hair. But what you're learning then is like what we discussed on the previous slide. It's about learning about what falls within the tradition. So that would be a conservative modulation. Whereas cut taxes, at least on its first use, it wasn't like that. On its first use, it was metaphorical. And actually what's happened, of course, is that there's a new tradition being set up. And if you look in dictionaries, you'll see that uses like this actually have a separate sublisting. And that's right, because they're really very different. So yeah, 1A are all within the tradition. The first use of 1D drew on that tradition, but wasn't intended to fall within it. So there's a sharp distinction there, and we're getting it right. Our distinction is getting this right. So it solves the problem. We can have variable senses expressed, which are literal, A, B, C. That's okay, they're within the tradition. And we can have a sense which is also a different sense, but which is outside of the tradition, and therefore it's metaphorical, or it was in its first use in the case of 1D. It's now very lexicalized. So that's in a way the major advantage. Just to finish off quickly, verbal metaphors are no problem. So the motor complained, that's an example from a recent paper, metaphorical use of complain. Complain here is used in a way that depends on the literal tradition of, people complaining, people saying things about things, but doesn't belong to it. How do we know? Well, look, if I'm doing a project on sociopragmatics, studying complaints, and somebody says, oh, people say things like the motor complained, I'm not going to go out and study motors. That would be the wrong thing to do. I'm not going to extend my fieldwork to motors because of that. That's outside of the tradition. It's not about complaints, actually. It's about something else. But of course, it depends on the tradition. You wouldn't have used that word complain unless there was this tradition of using the word complain to talk about people who are actually complaining. I'll skip negated metaphors and twice out metaphors. They're no problem for us. Final thing is just to say, on metonymy, it comes out as non-literal with no added stipulations. So the first use of 10 Downing Street to refer to a group of people who work at 10 Downing Street relied on the tradition in which the name refers to the building, but it wasn't intended to belong to that tradition. So again, this asymmetric dependency. The ham sandwiches parked out back. Similarly, you can't learn about ham sandwiches from this use except indirectly, of course, by learning about people who consume them. It's not directly about ham sandwiches, obviously. So you can't learn from it that ham sandwiches drive cars. That would be a bad mistake. The information channel is blocked, just as in metaphorical uses, and we claim for just the same reason. So that's it. Final thought, just to finish. So the traditional deviation picture has two components, actually, which have been insufficiently distinguished up till now. One is non-literal uses contrast with literal use because in literal use, what's meant by word is equal to the linguistically encoded meaning of the word, whereas in non-literal uses, it's not. The other component is that non-literal uses of words depend asymmetrically on the literal. And we've said that ubiquitous lexical modulation, we agree, it forces you to give up one. We've set out a deviation account based on 2 without 1, and we argue that this is compatible with ubiquitous lexical modulation, and it's attractive in various other ways, some of which I've just set out. So it turns out that asymmetric dependency is the core of deviation views of the literal, non-literal distinction, if we're right. That's it. Thanks very much. Ready for questions, comments, refutations.
Thank you, Nick. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
I'm sure like a lot of people are thinking and formulating questions. Do we have anyone wants to? Francisco, yeah. There's a comment in the chat from Francisco. Very nice talk. Yeah.
There are a couple of
2 people raised hands. Apparently, I can't see somehow.
I guess
Michelle.
if I stop the share, maybe we can see each other better.
Okay, we have Michelle and Brandis. Yeah.
Hi there.
Hello. Hi. Thank you very much for such an interesting talk. I've got 2 questions, but I'll just ask one, and then if this time I'll come back. So just I've got a picture of your definition of a non-literal use on my phone. So on this account, a non-literal use is a use of a word W that neither is a use that's neither an originating use nor made with intention to conform to such a use. So like the speaker's intention where the intention to conform matters a lot. So I was just wondering about this kind of a case. Suppose it's an intuitively literal use, say a dead metaphor, say John is a lion or John's a lamb or something like that. Say it's literal. Well, I don't know, like, so I'm thinking about case, it's literal, but the speaker let's say the speaker is ESL, they aren't aware of certain kind of literal usage of the word, which was originally metaphorical, non-literal, but for the speaker, they sort of deliberately violate the norm, wanting to not conform to the norm, but utter the utterance that's intuitively literal for competent speakers or like fluent speakers of that. Does that make sense? So is non-literal use always defined in terms of the speaker's intention? So you would allow a case where it's literal for most other speakers, but non-literal, because non-literal only in the sense of like the speaker's kind of the references to, sorry, am I making sense? Okay.
I think so. Mark, do you want to? I can say a little bit, and then maybe Mark wants to say things. I don't know. On dead metaphors. So this is not answering your question directly, but I guess John is a lion. Those things like that, I think those are very conventionalized. The really dead ones are things like eye of a needle, I guess. Yeah, where you could just learn that if you're learning a language as a first or a second language, and you might not, you might learn that before you learn the literal I. So that one's probably a completely dead metaphor. I don't know if that helps with the example, but the general point you were making seems right, I guess, which is that, if I've understood correctly, which is that if we make what's literal and what's not literal depend on speaker intentions, there could be cases where the speaker has some mistaken beliefs and therefore their intentions sort of target things which are not right or not true about the language as a whole. Yeah.
So for instance, with the eye of a needle case, suppose I've never heard of this phrase. Suppose I have no idea how to refer to the eye of a needle in English, let's say, right? And I suppose, in my native language, there's this phrase, eye of needle, and I just translate that into English, right? So, hang on a sec. Or maybe maybe that, not translation case, but maybe something like, I creatively use this phrase, the eye of a needle. But
Sure.
for me, it's a non-literal use, right? And it's a non-literal use according to your definition.
Yeah,
but for other speakers, it's not non-literal. So is it always with reference to the speaker?
Mark maybe wants to come in. I'm quite prepared to bite that particular bullet. I think for the speaker that would be in that particular scenario. It seems like the speaker would have certainly aimed at a non-literal use. But anyway, Mark, you
maybe in that case, in the idiolect of the speaker at the time, eye of the needle is somehow figurative. And what he gets wrong is how his idiolect relates to English or to any other kind of bigger chunk of language.
Yeah.
But it's a tricky example. It's you can go different ways around that. It's an interesting case. But that would be my inclination. Yeah.
Mine too, for what it's worth. Yeah, because it looks like. So suppose you just haven't. I mean, it doesn't have to be somebody who's working in a second language. Suppose you just have never learned eye of a needle. You just never met needles before, and you just happen to invent as an intended metaphor to name this thing because you don't know that it has a name in the tradition around you. You just come up with the same thing, which for everybody else around you is a dead metaphor. And then I think what Mark said about the idiolect and the community languages, I think that's a very tempting thing to say. Yeah. So it would be figurative for that speaker. I think that's okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay. I think we have Valandis and Valentina with hands up. Maybe Valandis first and then Valentina.
It sounds the same, so don't worry if it's Valentina first, Valandis and Valentina. Okay, so I'd like to thank you too, Nicholas. I think it was very enlightening, and in certain respects, it also, your talk confirmed some of our intuitions too. I'd like to ask you a question though about lexical modulation because I know you worked on that. I read a paper of yours on lexical modulation. While I was listening to you explain what you explained about the prison example, I wasn't really sure where you stand exactly in relation to narrowing and broadening. So we all know that there is a single interpretive process that leads to two examples, and you quoted that, two outcomes. You quoted that, but we still have two outcomes, narrowing and broadening. Okay, so this sort of distinction, would you say that there's room for this distinction in your account? Would you say that it serves your purpose? Would you happily dispense with it? Would you say it's more confusing than it is enlightening? What would you say? Have you had the chance to think about this?
Yeah, sure. There are a number of things to say. So thanks for that. It's a nice question. So yeah, I mean,
I'm not saying, sorry to interrupt. I'm not suggesting that we should drop, a lexical modulation, because that's another thing. But the double outcome, that's the thing. Does it serve your purpose?
Yeah. So there are a number of moving parts here. So one thing is, it might not make sense to talk about narrowing and broadening, because if you think the input into the process is not something which has an extension, so it's not a concept which has an extension, then it doesn't make sense to talk about narrowing and broadening. But another thing is that, look, in general, it can't be the right way to think about ad hoc concepts. This is what we argued back in that 2012 paper, because there are things which intuitively are, where you've got the encoded word, and you've got an ad hoc use of it, and they're intuitively different uses, and yet they could be coextensive. So on the output side, it might be right to say that we get different.
Did we?
Am I the only one who lost him, or?
I think we lost Nick.
Yeah.
There's that moment where everyone wonders if it's them or. Let's give it a second, see if he.
Yeah. Or Mark, would you like to come in here while Nick is possibly trying to come back in? No? Shall we just wait for Nick?
Okay. Kate and Ryoko, can I ask you a question? I mean, I'd like to seize the opportunity. Are you going to organize another relevance theoretic conference?
We hope so. We have a lot of things in the pipeline.
At some point, yeah, it's certainly something we want to do again in the future, and I think we'd like to do something where we could physically be in the same place as well, perhaps, maybe. Yeah. Don't know, but we're still recovering from the last one.
Understandable.
Nick's gone, so hopefully that means he's coming back.
Yeah.
And that he didn't talk for too long before he realised he'd froze.
Oh, he's coming back in. He's back.
Hello, I'm back. Hopefully, I'm sorry, my home internet fell over. I don't know why. It doesn't usually do that. Hopefully Mark has answered the question while I've been away.
No,
Do you want me to carry on with where I was? Yeah, look, so there are reasons to think that when somebody uses a word in a way which is somehow different from what you think is the encoded sense, still narrowing and broadening is not the right way to talk about that. We say in this paper that the current talk is based on that we can adopt a lot of the Sperber and Wilson model of what's going on in terms of processing, though. So not the narrowing and broadening part. But if that happens, that's purely incidental at best, on our view. But we can adopt the view that, when somebody uses a word, that gives access to a store of information associated with the word. And for example, in metaphorical uses, you draw on some of that information, but not other bits of that information. All of that is totally fine by us. So the processing account much of the processing account that is put forward by, relevance theorists, for example, is, as far as we can see, completely compatible with what we wanted to say today. But it is important, the key point for us is that the theory of communication has to make a distinction between literal and metaphorical meaning. And you can't do that in terms of broadening and narrowing. You need to do that somewhere else.
Okay. Well, that was very clear. Thank you.
Okay, and we have Valentina with hand up. Is she still there? Yeah.
Yes, here I am. Sorry for the
Oh.
camera off, but it's cooking time for
Oh.
for us in Italy, and so I was not showing myself. So Nick, thank you, and also Mark for the great talk. I'm always interested in the theoretical distinction between metaphors and literal items, because for me these are two conditions in my experiments. And I remember when I submitted one of my first studies where I was comparing metaphors and literal items, and then metonymy and literal items and approximation and not approximated uses. This was sent to Journal of Semantics, and some reviewers said, on what basis do you assume that there is a distinction between literal and metaphorical items? And eventually the paper was rejected. So I wish you had done this earlier so I could have used it to ground my distinction. But my question is the following. There's a challenging passage in the Sperber-Wilson paper, the one on the deflationary account on metaphor, where they say that metaphor hence is not a natural kind. Okay, and I've always been a bit intrigued and puzzled by that. And so what's your opinion on it? So you think that the distinction between literal and metaphorical meaning should be maintained, but is it at it's a working distinction at the operational level, or is it something more ontological, such as that metaphor is a natural kind in a way? Thank you.
Nice question. Thank you very much. It's good to see you. I hope dinner was nice, by the way. And not burnt if you were listening to the talk.
No, it's still there, still there.
Yeah, I mean, I very carefully avoided sort of ontologically loaded talk of natural kinds. But I mean, it depends. I think what they mean when they say it's not a natural kind is something like what I meant when I said that it's not something which features in their theory, right? So it's not something over which the theory has operations. And this is one definition in the literature on natural kinds of natural kinds. So if you've got a scientific theory and it operates over protons, then okay, protons are a natural kind for that theory, something like that. If that's the right way to think about natural kinds, then I guess they're not committed to it not being a natural kind in any theory. They're committed to it not being a natural kind in a theory of processing, if they spoke a bit more carefully, I guess. But I'm not trying to correct them. Whereas I guess we could say we're committed to that. It's a distinction which is theoretically important in a theory of communication. We're committed to that. And then whether that buys you, whether that commits us to literal use and metaphorical use, or literal use and figurative use being distinct natural kinds, depends on your view of natural kinds. And there are different theories out there. I wouldn't mind saying so. I don't know what Mark thinks about this. I don't know if we've discussed this as such.
I think it depends very much. I mean, natural kind is such a loaded term that's really unhelpful. I mean, elephants are natural kind. I don't think that metaphors are in any way a natural kind like this. So if one can avoid natural kind in this context and spell it out in some other way, that would be good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That's
but still they
okay.
are associated to specific patterns of response at the neurophysiological level, sort of.
That's interesting to hear you say that. Yeah. So I probably should have hedged a bit on that slide I had about experimental pragmatics to say, well, look, there's some evidence going the other way. There are different, yeah. despite the ERPs in that particular graph that I borrowed from you, for which many thanks, looking very, very similar. There are, of course, sometimes some different patterns.
True.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and from our point of view, they're different theoretically, right? So we have a theory of what it is to make a literal use and what it is to produce a metaphorical or a figurative use. And those are really different things. So, you know, the different natural kinds are, you know, is telling the truth and telling lies different natural kind, you know, it's got sort of similar status to those kinds of things. They're very distinct and they matter in the theory of communication. And then it depends how queasy you are about natural kind talk in that kind of theory, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if there any other questions or comments?
Yeah, we've got another hand up.
Yeah.
We've got Michelle.
Yeah, Michelle?
Yes, I have one or two questions. So one is, so am I correctly understanding that on your account, there is a sharp distinction between literal and non-literal insofar as that whether to have intention or not is, you know, you either have intention or don't have the intention, or depends on how you think about intention. But suppose you either have the intention or not have the intention to conform, and that means the distinction between literal and non-literal is a sharp distinction. So there's some qualitative difference. So that would set your account as a different account to the second option, I remember. But we do have this intuition that literal and non-literal is kind of a grady, you know, it's a spectrum thing, you know, with some cases like the bank swallowed the card, my card. That's, you know, we're not quite sure whether it's literal or non-literal. So do you want to bite the bullet that our intuitions about literal and non-literal, the distinction between literal and non-literal, sometimes, you know, like there's a sharp distinction. Sorry, I'm a philosopher, so my question is a bit like nitpicking. So on your account, it's a sharp distinction, but our intuition about the distinction seems to be, you know, there are lots of vague cases, unclear cases.
Yeah, that's a lovely question.
Go
on then, Mark.
Yeah, I think that's right, but maybe it's a sharp distinction, but it's very hard to assess whether something is made with intention to perform or not. So as you put it yourself in terms of we're not sure which way to go. I think that's right. You might think if you look at the psychological reality, it's sharp, but it's epistemically very hard to find out whether this is literal or non-literal one, because you have to go on certain evidence about the intention and so on. And they can be pulled into different directions. That's why it's so difficult to assess whether this computer talk, I mean, is it literal or non-literal?
Well, so yeah, in many cases, I won't have the epistemic access to the speaker's intention. So some cases I will fail, right? Because it's all about speaker's intention on this account. It's not just about some access to a norm or, you know, pattern or conformity. It's to the speaker, right?
That's right. But that's one reason why I mentioned that, you know, when Jerry Fodor said it, you know, it's actually once you know about him, then it's very, very clear that he meant it literally. And when Georges Ray says it, you know, he means it literally, and he'll thump the table and tell you he means it literally. But it's very, very clear based on various commitments that they have, right? It's a sort of central tenet of a particular theory. So in some cases, it can be unclear because you don't have access to the right intentions or evidence that would tell you what they are. In some cases, as it were, the very same sentence uttered by somebody else, it can be very clear. I wanted to just add, there can be various things affecting the phenomenology as well, right? And that might not track very well with this probably sharp, you know, arguably sharp distinction. So, you know, there's lexicalization and gradual deadening, and that gives you maybe that might give you a continuum of phenomenology, but that's something else. And then there's also just something about conspicuousness, right? So the conspicuousness of the internal evidence within the utterance, right? So in the ATM case, you know, if you say you swallowed the card, spat it out, you know, and you sort of stack this stuff up, then you make it very, very conspicuous that it must have been intended metaphorically. Whereas if it's just swallowed the card, it's not so conspicuous. And so, you know, the phenomenology, the way people feel about it will probably be tracking that kind of thing. But that's not the distinction that we're drawing, right? The distinction we're drawing is in terms of people's intentions, but they're not unrelated, right? Because you can signal your intention more or less clearly, as it were. And you could signal it more or less clearly with the words you use, but also by putting it in a particular context.
Yeah, I would think that the conformity and non-conformity, your account actually can, to some extent, well, to a large extent, explain the felt discrepancy. So Recanati's criteria, because, you know, it's the intuition there's some kind of norm being violated. The person is not conforming to the usage, but whether the person is conforming or not, I could be wrong. But it sort of accounts for the sort of the phenomena fairly well. Yeah, but
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting, and I think I agree. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. Is there any other question? Because if not, I think we are going over time now. But thanks again, Nick. It was really interesting, and we are so glad that we managed. You joined us today, and you started our third year running of Relevance Researchers Network.
Well, thank you again very much for inviting us, Ryoko and Kate as well. It's been a pleasure, and thank you everybody. Well, all the people who are still here for coming and for your great patience. So it's very, very kind of you, all of you. Thank you.
Okay, so we will be here again on the last Wednesday of each month until June, and next one will be 29th of March, same time, 5:30 UK Ireland time. We will have Daniel Pinder, who will talk on do the talk entitled "The Poetic Effects of Complex Poetry, Syntactic Ellipsis, Weak Explicature, and more." So that's going to be our next one. Okay, so thanks again for coming today, and see you hopefully